It's my honor to introduce James McPherson. I'm just going to set the table a little bit here before introducing him. It's really incredibly hard to say anything new about the American Civil War when there are so many people who know so much more, and in this room, someone knows the most. We're really pleased to have James McPherson here to talk to us about it. Let me provide data. That's what I'm good at. To situate us in a probably our most momentous and tragic fratricidal moment, a moment that led to loss and redemption, we hope. 4 million men, women, and children were held in slavery. Nearly 3 million men fought in the Civil War. The war was scattershot, fought in almost 10,000 sites around the country. The military technology of the mighty ball rifle was way ahead of the era's military tactics. The resulting loss of life, the lining up and mowing down of hundreds of thousands of men, might rival even the Iraq-Iran war. In 2 days alone, in the Battle of Shiloh, nearly 24,000 men north and south were killed and wounded. Shiloh's losses exceed the total casualty count from all the previous American wars up to then combined. Approximately 625,000 Americans were killed, another 405,000 wounded during the Civil War. If you compare that to the Vietnam War saw 26 Americans dying on a daily basis. Compare that to World War II, 416. From 1861 to 1865, daily Civil War deaths averaged 599. I lay out these facts to help us better grasp, in our time of immediate gratification, iPhones and computers and tech conveniences, the most basic outline of what is at stake and why historical understanding is so important. Our liberties have cost millions of lives, and our inability to uphold those liberties enslaved millions more, with a legacy that continues to exercise a hold on our imaginations and poison the American experiment in democracy. That experiment, that nation brought forth on this continent, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, is certainly worth honoring and teaching our children to cherish and to preserve. James McPherson taught at Princeton University from 1962 to 2004, where he is currently the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor Emeritus of American History. He is the author of 15 books and the editor of another dozen, mostly on the era of the American Civil War and Reconstruction. His books have won several prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize for Battle Cry of Freedom, the Civil War era, the Lincoln Prize for Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War, and a second Lincoln Prize for Tried by War, Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. He has served as the president of the Society of American Historians and the American Historical Association. We are extremely pleased to have James here with us this morning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sergios, and thanks to all of you for your warm welcome. It's been a while since I taught an 8 o'clock class, so I'm hoping that I'm alert and that we're all alert. Just to reinforce the point that Mr. Fitzhugh was making, I look back on my own high school days, and my two high school history teachers for world history and American history were respectively the basketball coach and the baseball coach. Baseball coach was a World War II veteran, and we learned a lot about World War II in that class, but looking back on it now, I don't think we learned very much else about all of American history. When Abraham Lincoln breathed his last at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton intoned, "Now he belongs to the ages." Stanton's remark was actually more prescient than he knew, because Lincoln's image and legacy became the possession not only of future ages of Americans, but also of people of other nations. On the centenary of Lincoln's birth in 1909, the Russian author Leo Tolstoy described Lincoln as a Christ in miniature, a saint of humanity. An Islamic leader whom Tolstoy met in a remote part of the Caucasus had heard of no other American except Abraham Lincoln. And talking to Tolstoy, he projected a more militant image of Lincoln, declaring that Lincoln spoke with a voice of thunder and his deeds were as strong as the rock. When Jacqueline Kennedy lived in the White House, she sought comfort in the Lincoln room in times of trouble. The kind of peace I felt in that room, she recalled, was what you feel when going into a church. I used to feel his strength. I'd sort of be talking to him. Martin Luther King Jr. tried to persuade Jacqueline Kennedy's husband to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation on the 100th anniversary of the first, January 1st, 1963. John Kennedy demurred, so King went ahead on his own. When he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in August 1963 to deliver his "I Have a Dream" speech at the famous March on Washington, King declared, "50 years ago, a great American in whose shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been scarred in the flames of withering injustice." Lincoln could not anticipate the reverence that millions would feel for him in future ages. But he was intensely aware, as he told Congress in December 1861, when America was engulfed in that tragic Civil War. Lincoln then said that this struggle to preserve the Union is not altogether for today, it is for a vast future also. Lincoln actually had a profound sense of history. He didn't acquire it by formal education. He didn't study history in college or high school. Indeed, he didn't go to college or high school, and he didn't study it in history in school at all, because he had less than a year of formal schooling, parceled out a couple of months at a time, and that total year of schools included no history courses. The only work of history that Lincoln seems to have read as a boy was so-called Parson Weems' famous filial-pietistic biography of George Washington with its apocryphal story of the hatchet and the cherry tree. But that book actually made a lasting impression on Lincoln, probably not the story about the cherry tree, but other aspects of it. 40 years after he had first read it, President-elect Lincoln addressed the New Jersey legislature in Trenton, near the spot where George Washington's ragged troops had won a victory the day after Christmas 1776 that saved the American Revolution from collapse. On that occasion, Lincoln told the New Jersey legislators, "I remember all the accounts in Weems's book of the battlefields and struggles for the liberty of the country, and none fixed themselves as much on my imagination as the struggle here in Trenton. The crossing of the river, the contest with the Hessians, the great hardships endured at that time all fixed themselves on my memory more than any single revolutionary event. I recollect thinking then, boy even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for." These words were not merely an exercise in nostalgia. As always, Lincoln invoked the past for a purpose. On this occasion, he shifted from the Revolution to the present, his present, and future. Prospects for the United States in that present and future were dark. The country of which Lincoln would become president 11 days later was no longer the United States, but the disunited States. 7 slave states, fearing for the future of their peculiar institution in a nation governed by the new anti-slavery Republican Party, had seceded from the Union in response to Lincoln's election. Several more slave states were threatening to go out. Even as Lincoln spoke in Trenton, delegates from the first 7 states were meeting in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the independent nation of the Confederate States of America. Civil war, or a permanent division of the country with its dire precedent for future divisions, or both, loomed on the horizon. Thus, it's not surprising that when Lincoln shifted from his discussion of the Revolution to his present, he began, "I'm exceedingly anxious that what those men fought for, that's something even more than national independence, that's something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world for all time to come. I'm exceedingly anxious that this Union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made." The next day, February 22nd, Washington's birthday, Lincoln spoke at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where he spelled out more clearly what he believed was at stake both in the Revolution and in the crisis of 1861. "I have often inquired of myself," he said, "what great principle or idea it was that kept this Union so long together. It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence which gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time." At this point in Lincoln's remarks, the newspaper text indicated great applause from the audience, which included the city council and leading citizens of Philadelphia. Lincoln told them, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." Great cheering, according to the press. The ringing phrases that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, said Lincoln in 1861, gave promise not just to Americans, but hope to the world, that in due time the weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. And then cheers in the margins, in the parentheses of the newspaper. Now, Lincoln was, of course, painfully aware that many Americans enjoyed neither liberty nor equality. 4 million were slaves, making the United States the self-professed beacon of liberty to oppressed masses everywhere, making the United States the largest slaveholding country in the world. Lincoln grasped this nettle. "I hate the monstrous injustice of slavery," he had said in his famous Peoria speech back in 1854. "I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites." As for equality, Lincoln said on another occasion, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the founding fathers who signed it clearly did not intend to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not even mean to assert the obvious untruth that all men in 1776 were equal in rights and opportunities. Rather, Lincoln said, they meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. Like Thomas Jefferson, Lincoln asserted a universality and timelessness for the principle of liberty, equal rights, and equal opportunity on which the nation was founded. And Lincoln acknowledged his intellectual debt to Jefferson. Not Jefferson the slaveholder, Not Jefferson, the author of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1799, asserting the superiority of state over federal sovereignty. Not even Jefferson, the president, but Jefferson, the philosopher of liberty, author of the Northwest Ordinance that kept slavery out of future states comprising 160,000 square miles at a time when most existing states of the Union still had slavery. And the Jefferson who, even though he owned slaves, said of the institution that he trembled for his country when he remembered that God was just. This was the Jefferson, Lincoln said in 1859, who in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document, Declaration of Independence, an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. Universal and timeless, that truth may be, but in Jefferson's time it remained mostly, as Lincoln described it, abstract. Fate decreed that it fell to Lincoln, not Jefferson, to give substance and meaning to what Jefferson had called a self-evident truth. Ironically, it was the slaveholders who provided Lincoln the opportunity to do so, for by taking their states out of the Union, they set in train a progression of events that destroyed the very social and political order founded on slavery that they had seceded to preserve. Secession transformed the main issue before the country, at least for the time being, from slavery to disunion. When Lincoln became president, he confronted the question not what to do about slavery, but what to do about secession. On this question, Lincoln did not hesitate. Branding secession as the essence of anarchy, he insisted in 1861 that the central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that is upon us of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves. Lincoln had come a long way in his understanding of history since his boyhood reading of Weems's biography of George Washington. Like other thoughtful Americans, he was acutely conscious of the unhappy fate of most republics in the past. The United States stood almost alone in the mid-19th century as a democratic republic in a world bestrode by kings, queens, emperors, czars, petty dictators, theories of aristocracy. Some Americans alive at mid-century had seen two French republics rise and fall. The hopes of 1848 for the triumph of popular government in Europe had been shattered by the counter-revolutions that brought a conservative reaction in the old world. Would the American experiment in government of, by, and for the people also be swept into the dustbin of history? Not if Lincoln could help it. Our popular government has often been called an experiment, he told a special session of Congress that met on July 4th, 1861. 2 points in it our people have already settled: the successful establishing and the successful administering of it. One still remains: its successful maintenance against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it. If that attempt succeeded, Lincoln said, the forces of reaction in Europe would smile in smug satisfaction at this proof of their contention that the upstart republic, launched in 1776, could not last. Many in the North shared Lincoln's conviction that democracy was on trial in this war. "We must fight," proclaimed an Indianapolis newspaper 2 weeks after Confederate guns opened fire at Fort Sumter. "We must fight because we must. The national government has been assailed. the nation has been defied. If either can be done with impunity, neither nation nor government is worth a cent. War is self-preservation if our form of government is worth preserving. If monarchy would be better, it might be wise to quit fighting, admit that a republic is too weak to take care of itself, and invite some deposed duke or prince of Europe to come over here and rule us. But otherwise, we must fight. The outbreak of the war brought hundreds of thousands of northern men to recruiting offices. A good many of them expressed a similar sense of democratic mission as a motive for fighting. I do feel that the liberty of the world is placed in our hands to defend, wrote a Massachusetts soldier to his wife in 1862. And if we are overcome, then farewell to freedom. In 1863, on the second anniversary of his enlistment, an Ohio private wrote in his diary that he had not expected the war to last so long, but no matter how much longer it took, it must be carried on, as he put it, for the great principles of liberty and self-government at stake. For should we fail, the onward march of liberty in the old world will be retarded at least a century, and monarchs, kings, and aristocrats will be more powerful against their subjects than ever. This sense of mission, the American sense of mission, invoked by Lincoln and by these soldiers, the idea that the American experiment in democracy was a beacon of liberty for oppressed people everywhere, is as old as the Mayflower Compact. In our own time, this sentiment sometimes comes across as self-righteous posturing that inspires more resentment than admiration abroad. And the same was true in Lincoln's time, when the resentment was expressed mainly by upper-class conservatives, especially in Britain. But many spokesmen for the middle and working classes in Europe echoed the most chauvinistic Americans. During the debate that produced the British Reform Act of 1832, the London Working Men's Association pronounced the Republic of America to be a beacon of freedom for all mankind, while a British newspaper named the Poor Man's Guardian pointed to American institutions as the best precedent and guide to the oppressed and enslaved people of England in their struggle for the right of representation for every man. They capitalized that. In the preface to the 12th edition of his famous book, Democracy in America, written during the heady days of the 1848 democratic uprisings in Europe, Alexis de Tocqueville urged the leaders of France's newly created Second Republic to study American institutions as a guide to what Tocqueville called the approaching irresistible and universal spread of democracy throughout the world. When, instead of democracy, France got the Second Empire under Napoleon III, the Republican opposition to Napoleon's regime looked to the United States for inspiration. Many of the suggested reforms, wrote the historian of the French opposition, many of the suggested reforms would have remained utopic had it not been for the demonstrated existence of the United States and its republican institutions. The existence of the United States remained a thorn in the side of European reactionaries, according to a British radical newspaper, which declared in 1856, "To the oppressors of Europe, especially those of England, the United States is a constant terror and an everlasting menace, because it stands as a practical and triumphant refutation of the lying and servile sophists who maintain that without kings and aristocrats, civilized communities cannot exist." Once the Civil War broke out, some European monarchists and conservatives did indeed make no secret of their hope that the Union would fall into the dustbin of history. The powerful Times of London, probably the most influential newspaper in the world, at least in the English-speaking world, considered the likely downfall of what it called the American Colossus to be a good riddance of a nightmare. Excepting a few gentlemen of Republican tendencies, we all expect, we nearly all wish, success to the Confederate cause. The Earl of Shrewsbury expressed his cheerful belief that the dissolution of the Union is inevitable and that men before me will live to see an aristocracy established in America. The minister to the United States from the Tsar of all Russians echoed this opinion in 1863. The Republican form of government, so much talked about by the Europeans and so much praised by the Americans, is breaking down, he wrote. What can be expected from a country where men of humble origin are elevated to the highest positions? And of course, he meant Lincoln. This is democracy in practice, the democracy that European theorists rave about. If they could only see it at work, they would cease their agitation and thank God for the government they are enjoying. Clearly, opinion in Europe supported Lincoln's conviction that the very survival of democracy was at stake in the Civil War. But in the first year and a half of the war, the problem of slavery muddied the clarity of this issue. The Confederacy, of course, was a slave society, which should have strengthened the Union's image abroad as the champion of liberty and equal rights. As Lincoln put it in a private conversation in January 1862 with Carl Schurz, one of the 48ers from Germany who had to escape Germany after the failure of the democratic revolutions there. As Lincoln said to Schurz, "I cannot imagine that any European power would dare to recognize and aid the Southern Confederacy if it became clear that the Confederacy stands for slavery and the Union for freedom." The problem was that at that time, the Union did not yet stand for freedom. Freedom of the slaves, at any rate. Constitutional constraints plus Lincoln's need to keep the Northern Democrats and the border slave states in his war coalition inhibited efforts to make it a war against slavery. This restraint puzzled and alienated many potential European friends of the Union cause. An English observer from the left in British politics asked in September 1861, "Since the North does not proclaim abolition and never pretended to fight for anti-slavery, how can we be fairly called upon to sympathize so warmly with the federal cause?" Lincoln, of course, recognized the validity of that question. In September 1862, he agreed with the delegation of anti-slavery clergymen that emancipation would help us in Europe and convince them that we are incited by something more than ambition. Now, when he said this, Lincoln had made up his mind to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. The balance of political forces in the North and military forces on the battlefield had shifted just enough to give this decision the impetus of public support, or at least so Lincoln hoped. Basing his action on the power of the commander-in-chief to seize enemy property being used to wage war against the United States, slaves were property and their labor was essential to the Confederate war economy, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, and then the final proclamation on January 1st, 1863, justifying it both as a military necessity and as an act of justice. The Emancipation Proclamation not only laid the groundwork for the total abolition of slavery in the United States a couple of years later, when it was accomplished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The proclamation also emancipated Lincoln from the contradiction of fighting a war for democratic liberty without fighting a war against slavery. Emancipation deepened Lincoln's sense of history. As he signed the proclamation on that New Year's Day, 1863, he said to colleagues who gathered to witness this historic occasion, I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. Lincoln here connected the act of emancipation with the future, if my name ever goes into history. As he had earlier connected the war for the Union with a past that had given Lincoln's generation the legacy of a united country. Just as the sacrifices of those who had fought for independence and nationhood in 1776 inspired Lincoln and the people he led, their sacrifices in the Civil War would leave a legacy of democracy and freedom to future generations. In his first annual message to Congress, we call it today the State of the Union message, the State of the Union Address, Lincoln, this is in December 1861, Lincoln declared that the struggle of today is not altogether for today. It is for a vast future also. Lincoln sent his second annual message to Congress in December 1862, just before he issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. On this occasion, he defined the war's meaning by linking past, present, and future in a passage of unsurpassed eloquence and power. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. I said a moment ago that Lincoln's eloquence in this passage was unsurpassed, but he did surpass himself nearly a year later in the prose poem of 272 words that we know as the Gettysburg Address. In this elegy for Union soldiers killed in the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln wove together past, present, and future with two other sets of three images each: continent, nation, battlefield, birth, death, rebirth. At the risk of destroying the speech's poetic qualities, let me disaggregate these parallel images of past, present, future, continent, nation, battlefield, birth, death, rebirth. To do so will underscore the meaning of the Civil War, not only for Lincoln's time, but also for the generations into the future to come. 77 years in the past, Lincoln said, our fathers brought forth, that is, gave birth, on this continent, a nation conceived in liberty. Today, in 1863, our generation faces a great test whether a nation so conceived can endure. In dedicating the cemetery on this battlefield, the living must take inspiration to finish the task that those who lie buried here so nobly advanced by giving their last full measure of devotion. Life and death in this passage have a paradoxical relationship. Men died that the nation might live. Yet the old Union also died, and with it would die the institution of slavery. After these deaths, the nation must have a new birth of freedom, so that government of, by, and for the people that our fathers conceived and brought forth in the past shall not perish from the earth, but live on into the vast future. Although Lincoln gave this address at the dedication of a cemetery, its rhetoric was secular. As the war went on, however, Lincoln's efforts to come to grips with the mounting toll of death, destruction, suffering became more infused with religious inquiry. Perhaps God was punishing Americans with this terrible war for some great sin. By the time of his inauguration for a second term, Lincoln believed he had identified that sin. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, Lincoln said in his second inaugural address. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Fortunately, the war lasted only a few more weeks after Lincoln's second inauguration. The impact abroad of Union victory was almost immediate. In Britain, a disgruntled Tory member of Parliament expressed disappointment that the Union had not broken in two or perhaps more fragments, as he put it, for he considered the United States, in his words, a menace to the whole civilized world. A Tory colleague described this menace as the beginning of an Americanizing process in England. The new democratic ideas are gradually to find embodiment. Indeed, they were. In 1865, a liberal political economist at the University College London, Edward Beazley, who favored the expansion of voting rights in Britain, pointed the moral of Union victory across the Atlantic. Our opponents told us that republicanism was on trial in the American Civil War, Beazley said. They insisted on our watching what they called its breakdown. They told us that it was forever discredited in England. Well, we accepted the challenge. We staked our hopes boldly on the result. Under a strain such as no aristocracy, no monarchy, no empire could have supported, Republican institutions have stood firm. It is we now who call upon the privileged classes to mark the result. A vast impetus has been given to Republican sentiments in England. Well, Queen Victoria's throne was safe. The UK did not become a republic. But a 2-year debate in Parliament, in which the American example figured prominently, led to enactment of the Reform Bill of 1867, which nearly doubled the eligible electorate and enfranchised a large part of the British working class for the first time. With this act, the world's most powerful nation, Britain, took a long stride toward democracy. What might have happened to the Reform Bill if the North had lost the Civil War, thereby confounding liberals and confirming Tory opinions of democracy, is impossible to say. The end of slavery in the reunited states sounded the death knell of the institution in Brazil and Cuba, the only other places in the Western Hemisphere where it still existed. Commending the Brazilian government's first steps toward the abolition of slavery in 1871. An abolitionist in that country was glad, as he put it, to see Brazil receive so quickly the moral of the Civil War in the United States. Even without Northern victory in the war, slavery in the United States, Brazil, and Cuba would have been unlikely to survive into the next millennium, but it might well have survived into the next century. And without the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, which, like the 13th, were a direct consequence of the war, and which granted equal civil and political rights to African Americans, the United States might have developed into even more of an apartheid society in the 20th century than it did. These amendments consummated a new interpretation of liberty in the American polity. Lincoln played a crucial role in the evolution of this new concept of liberty. In April 1864, he chose the occasion of a public speech in Baltimore to define the difference between two meanings of this word that is so central to America's understanding of itself. The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty. Lincoln declared in that state of Maryland, which actually still had slavery but was about to abolish it, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here are two not only different but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. As he often did, Lincoln went on to illustrate that point with a parable. One of the first books he had read as a child and helped him to learn to read was Aesop's Fables. And throughout his life, Lincoln told apparently simple stories about animals to make subtle and profound points about important matters. And he did that here. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, he said, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as a destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep is a black one. Plainly, the sheep and the wolf are not agreed upon a definition of the word liberty, and precisely the same difference prevails today among us human creatures, even in the North, and all professing to love liberty. Hence we behold the processes by which thousands are daily passing from under the yoke of bondage, hailed by some as the advance of liberty, and bewailed by others as the destruction of all liberty. The shepherd in this fable was, of course, Lincoln himself. The black sheep was the slave, and the wolf was the slave's owner. Lincoln in this parable was drawing a distinction between what the late philosopher Isaiah Berlin described as negative liberty and positive liberty. The concept of negative liberty is perhaps more familiar. It can be defined as the absence of restraint, a freedom from interference by outside authority with individual thought or behavior. Laws requiring automobile passengers to wear seatbelts or motorcyclists to wear helmets are a violation of their liberty to go without seatbelts or helmets. Negative liberty, therefore, is best described as freedom from. Positive liberty can be defined as freedom to. Freedom to live longer and better because of wearing a seatbelt or helmet has saved one from death or injury. Perhaps the example of freedom of the press provides a better illustration of the difference between negative and positive liberty. Freedom of the press is usually understood as a negative liberty, freedom from interference with what a writer writes or a reader reads. But an illiterate person suffers from denial of positive liberty. He's unable to enjoy the freedom to read or write whatever he pleases, not because some authority prevents him from doing so, but because he cannot read or write anything. The remedy lies not in removal of restraint, but in achievement of the capacity to read and write, positive liberty. Another way of defining the difference between these two concepts of liberty is to describe their relation to power. Negative liberty and power are at opposite poles. Power is the enemy of liberty, especially power in the hands of a central government. Negative liberty was the preeminent concern of Americans in the 18th and first half of the 19th centuries. Many feared the federal government as the main threat to individual liberty, and of course some still do today. Americans fought their revolution against the overweening power of king and parliament. In the Constitution, Americans fragmented power among the three branches of the federal government, between the two houses of Congress, and between the national and state governments. But even this was not enough. In James Madison's words, to prevent what Madison called the tendency in all governments to an augmentation of power at the expense of liberty. So the founders wrote a Bill of Rights, which in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution imposed limits on the power of the federal government. Throughout early American history, political leaders remained vigilant against the concentrations of power. Andrew Jackson vetoed the charter renewal of the Second Bank of the United States in 1832 because, he said, such a combination of private wealth and government power would cause our liberties to be crushed. In 1854, the famous reformer of mental hospitals, or as they were called then, insane asylums, Dorothea Dix, persuaded Congress to pass a bill granting public lands to the states to subsidize improved facilities for the mentally ill. President Franklin Pierce vetoed the bill because, as he wrote in his veto message, if Congress could enact such a law, it has the same power to provide for the indigent who are not insane, and thus the whole field of public beneficence is thrown open to the care and culture of the federal government. Sounds familiar? This would mean all sovereignty vested in the absolute consolidated central power against which the spirit of liberty has so often and in so many countries struggled in vain. Therefore, a law to improve mental hospitals, Pierce concluded, would be the beginning of the end of our blessed inheritance of representative liberty. Owners of slaves also relied on this bulwark of negative liberty to defend their right of property in human beings. John C. Calhoun and other Southern political leaders constructed an elaborate structure of state sovereignty and limitations on national power. No exercise of federal power escaped the censure of these pro-slavery libertarians. As Senator Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina explained, if Congress can make banks, roads, and canals under the Constitution, they can free any slave in the United States. The ultimate manifestation of negative liberty was secession. Southern states left the Union in 1861 because they feared that sometime in the future, the growing northern anti-slavery majority embodied in the Republican Party would exercise its power to free the slaves, a form of positive liberty that might even go so far as to empower those freed slaves to read and write, to vote, and to aspire to equality with whites, a truly frightening scenario of positive liberty. Yet, ironically, as I mentioned earlier, by seceding and provoking a war, Southern states hastened the very achievement of positive liberty they had gone to war to prevent. By 1864, when Lincoln told his parable about the shepherd protecting the black sheep from the wolf, that shepherd, Lincoln, wielded a very big staff as commander-in-chief of the largest army yet known in the United States. It took every ounce of that power to accomplish the new birth of freedom that Lincoln invoked at Gettysburg. Tragically, Lincoln did not live to oversee advancement toward that goal. His earlier definition of equality as a maxim for free society, even though never perfectly attained, constantly labored for, and thereby constantly spreading deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors, suggests the policies of positive liberty he would have pursued had he lived. But at Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth ended that possibility as he shouted Virginia's state motto, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always tyrants, the slogan of negative liberty. But Lincoln's party carried on the tradition of positive liberty with its efforts to legislate and enforce equal civil rights, voting rights, and education during Reconstruction. As Republican Congressman George Julian noted in 1867, the only way to achieve justice and equality for the freedmen of the South is by the strong arm of power outstretched from the central authority here in Washington. Or as Congressman James Garfield, a future Republican president, put it also in 1867, we must plant the heavy hand of authority upon these rebel communities and plant liberty on the ruins of slavery. That's what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution tried to do. These amendments radically transformed the thrust of the Constitution from negative to positive liberty. Instead of the straitjacket of thou shalt nots imposed on the federal government by the Bill of Rights, the Civil War amendments established a precedent whereby 9 of the next 14 constitutional amendments contained the phrase, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article. Lincoln himself set this precedent by helping to draft the 13th Amendment, which of course was the centerpiece of the platform on which he was reelected in 1864 and then constituted a major effort, as you've seen in the movie Lincoln, to get through Congress in 1865. Lincoln's party continued its commitment to positive liberty at least through the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. In the 20th century, however, the two major parties gradually reversed positions. The Democratic Party, once the bastion of negative liberty, states' rights, and limited government, donned the mantle of positive liberty, while most Republicans invoked the mantra of negative liberty. And now it is the Democratic Party that has brought Lincoln's legacy full circle with the election and re-election of our first African-American president, who first announced his candidacy in 2007 in the old Illinois State House where Lincoln gave his famous House Divided Address in 1858. Obama took his oath of office both times on the same Bible that Lincoln used for that purpose in 1861, made the new birth of freedom that Lincoln had invoked at Gettysburg the theme of his first inaugural address, and in his second inaugural address just a couple of months ago, echoed Lincoln's statement that it is the responsibility of government to help people to do what they cannot do entirely by themselves, a central tenet of positive liberty. Lincoln's legacy will persist even as the tensions between positive and negative liberty continue, as they do virtually every day, to play out in the American political process. Well, thanks. I appreciate your attention, and I'm prepared to answer questions for a few minutes if we have the time, I think.
If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Right here.
Yes, thank you for reminding us that Abraham Lincoln in his lifetime had less than 1 year of schooling. So I have a two-part question. How is it possible that our greatest president was also our least schooled? Secondly, this unschooled president on his own learned geometry and learned mathematics and went back 2,000 years to read the Greek Euclid, and he would read Euclid for pleasurable reading, and he was probably our best president at numbers, this unschooled man. Jefferson never did that, but Lincoln did. What's the explanation?
I think the explanation is that Lincoln had an insatiable curiosity to learn, to know, to understand. He once talked about when he was a child, a boy, listening to conversations among his father and his father's friends and not really being able to understand everything they were talking about. And he would go up to his room and with a sense of frustration to try to think through what they meant by some of their impenetrable comments in these conversations. And he would work through this until he understood it. His law partner, William Herndon, talked about the way in which Lincoln would never be satisfied with with any legal question that came before him until he had taken it apart and understood every aspect of it and then put it back together again. In a sense, he was like the boy with a mechanical aptitude who takes things apart to understand how they work and then puts them back together again. Maybe they don't work very well, and he puts them back together again, but he learns from that process. Well, Lincoln did that mentally, and I think that's why he, on his own, studied Euclidean geometry. He wanted to understand how that worked, and he was not satisfied until he figured it out. So even though he had only 1 year of schooling, he basically was self-educated by this process of trying to understand. Even if it's something like Aesop's Fables, he would read a story about animals, and then he would try to, he said, what's the meaning of this? It may be interesting, but what's the deeper meaning of it? And so he would worry that issue until he understood it. So I think that's basically the explanation. He was an autodidact, and he was never satisfied until he understood something. John Hay, his private secretary, said that Lincoln was a very slow reader. But he was a slow reader because he was trying to figure out what every sentence meant. He didn't just glide over things, and if he didn't fully understand, just keep going. He would stop and try to figure it out.
Professor, what is your favorite movie about Abraham Lincoln?
Well, I think my favorite movie would have to be the recent Steven Spielberg movie called Lincoln. I've seen other movies about Lincoln, the ones that were made in the late 1930s, The Young Mr. Lincoln and Abe Lincoln from Illinois. And they're interesting. They're somewhat romanticized. They were good movies for their times, and in fact, they were dealing with issues of the Depression and World War II as much as anything, and the coming World War II as much as anything else. And of course, Steven Spielberg's movie on Lincoln deals with, by implication at least, with contemporary issues as well. But I think it's the best movie. I think it really profoundly gets at Lincoln's character and about the meaning of the Civil War in many respects.
The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free the slaves in the border states, which weren't in secession. Did Lincoln ever talk about that?
Yes, he did. Quite a few people pointed out that apparent contradiction. His Secretary of the Treasury, Samuel P. Chase, who was a strong anti-slavery proponent, tried to persuade him to extend the Emancipation Proclamation to the border states, and also the state of Tennessee and parts of Virginia and Louisiana were exempted because they were occupied, or mostly occupied, by federal troops and therefore deemed not to be at war with the United States. But Lincoln said that the only legal grounds for his proclamation were his powers, war powers, as commander-in-chief in time of war to seize enemy property being used to wage war against the United States. That's the legal ground for the Emancipation Proclamation. And so he made these exemptions because these areas, he believed, or he argued, were not at war with the United States. He had earlier tried to persuade congressmen from the border states to undertake emancipation on their own, the abolition of slavery on their own, with federal compensation to the owners for their economic losses. They had turned him down. They had refused, even though Congress had passed a resolution offering compensation to any state that undertook gradual abolition of slavery on its own. And Lincoln had decided to go ahead with the Emancipation Proclamation with, I think, the anticipation that if the North won the war and therefore slavery really was ended in the Deep South, in the Confederate States, slavery in the border states could never survive. And indeed, that's what happened. And he also took steps in his process of Reconstruction, wartime Reconstruction, to to use political patronage, to use the power of the government to persuade some of the border states to move on their own, and the state of Maryland did so. At the time Lincoln gave that speech in Baltimore that I quoted on the nature of meanings of liberty, there was a state constitutional amendment that had just been adopted by the Maryland legislature to abolish slavery in Maryland. And that passed very narrowly in a referendum in October of 1864. And the same thing was going on in Tennessee and in Arkansas, which where Lincoln had undertaken through executive leadership a process of trying to restore those states to the Union under the leadership of Unionists who took an oath of allegiance and so on. So he was using as much federal power as he could in the latter part of the war to undertake the abolition of slavery in those states. In Kentucky, which was one of the most recalcitrant of the border states, Congress actually provided for, and Lincoln carried out, the freeing of slaves who enlisted in the Union Army from Kentucky, which started happening in 1864. And the bounty, the federal bounty for enlistments, was actually paid to their masters. So that was a kind of quasi-compensation in 1864 for slave owners in Kentucky, with compensation that not very many people realize. So there were lots of steps being taken even after the exemptions of the Emancipation Proclamation to move toward the abolition of slavery in those areas that were exempted, and of course the 13th Amendment finally accomplished that.
One more very brief question.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson. I'm Morris Cunningham from UMass Boston, and I have 5 of my students with me today who are taking the political thought of Abraham Lincoln, so we take it pretty seriously over there. I'm in the midst of reading John Burt's Lincoln's Tragic Pragmatism, which one of the arguments is that Lincoln, notwithstanding his protestations that he would not favor political and social equality for the Negro, that political and social equality was at least implicit in Lincoln's arguments in the 1858 debates with Douglas, and perhaps as early as the Peoria speech in 1854. I wonder what your view is on, did Lincoln adopt the idea of political and social equality, or was it merely implicit?
Well, of course, in 1858, when Lincoln disavowed any intention to support political and social equality in the debates with Douglas, Douglas was mercilessly attacking him, playing the race card against Lincoln, and he felt he had to respond. I've always thought that it's a mistake to cite Lincoln's statements in 1858 as examples of his permanent belief on this question. He had an open mind on some of these issues, and especially, another issue, of course, is his support of colonization in 1861 and 1862, which he then later moved away from, especially after he had embraced the policy of recruiting blacks, including former slaves, as Union soldiers. And I think that policy and Lincoln's experience with it and response to it is the major reason for his movement toward a commitment to at least political rights and civil rights, civil equality and political equality toward the end of his life. I think he had great admiration for and appreciation for the contribution that black soldiers and sailors, about 200,000 of them in the course of the entire war, made to ultimate Union victory, and he said so publicly many times. And I think that moved him substantially in the direction of a commitment to at least civic, civil, and political rights for the freed slaves, which he publicly endorsed in what turned out to be the last speech of his life in April 11th, 1865. So to cite what he said in 1858 as evidence for his beliefs and his policies, I think is wrong, because there's a great deal of distance between 1858 and 1864 and 1865, and Lincoln traveled a great deal of that distance.